What if the oldest chapters of our story were never truly lost, only muffled like a whisper beneath layers of dust and rewritten memory? Sometimes it feels as though a quiet absence hangs over the world, an outline of something once known, now folded into silence. The ruins, the fractured myths, the impossible timings. They don't speak loudly, yet they unsettle with the softness of a question we were meant to forget. Still, if we listen gently enough, a thread remains. A faint pulse of another time, another truth. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy stories that drift between dream and history. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It begins with a silence that feels misplaced, as though something vast once moved through the world and then receded so cleanly that only the emptiness of its absence was allowed to remain. When people speak of ancient history, they often imagine the slow crawl of progress. Stone to bronze, bronze to iron, small villages swelling into city-states through the steady insistence of time. Yet underneath that familiar narrative lies a problem so large, so persistent, that it is almost always stepped over rather than examined. Civilizations do not usually appear fully formed. They grow, fracture, amend themselves, restart. But in the case of early Mesopotamia, of Eridu, of the enigmatic king said to have ruled before any written lineage should logically exist, the story feels less like a growth and more like a sudden arrival. A spark so bright one must squint to see its outline. Scholars have long debated the Sumerian king list, that strange document claiming impossible reigns stretching tens of thousands of years into the past. Some consider it symbolic, others political mythology. Yet there is something strangely deliberate in the way it presents its chronology. Kings before the flood, kings after the flood, a sequence broken not by embellishment, but by some boundary the scribes seemed compelled to preserve. The earliest rulers are described not as men but as beings who came down to govern, whose lifespans blur the line between memory and cosmic arithmetic. And although the text is fragmented, rewritten, recopied across centuries, its structure remains oddly consistent, as though the scribes were guarding a memory they themselves no longer fully understood. It is here, in this tension between impossibility and persistence, that the story of the last Anunnaki king begins to shimmer, not as a figure of fantasy, but as an echo carried through tablets carved long after the spoken word that birthed them faded. Eridu, the city the Sumerians called the first place of kingship, emerges from the archaeological record with an abruptness that unsettles even the most cautious researchers. The earliest levels reveal sophisticated architecture, planned, aligned, intentional, without an evolutionary build-up beneath them. It is as though someone swept across the plain and said, "Start here." And humanity listened. There are older settlements in the world, of course. Göbekli Tepe, with its monumental stone enclosures appearing too early and too refined. Jericho, layered with walls older than pottery. But Eridu holds a different energy, one wrapped in language, kingship, and a sense of instruction. Even in ruins it seems to hum with the residue of an origin story, written by hands that wanted to veil as much as they revealed. Yet something happened, something that fractured the continuity hinted at in those tablets. Archaeological layers show a disruption, environmental shifts around 3200 BCE, salinization patterns hinting at ecological collapse, signs of abandonment and reoccupation. But beneath these material traces lies a deeper fracture, a break in memory. Myths shift, genealogies blur, the divine kings recede, and humanity begins telling the story, in which it alone is the main character. The rupture is quiet but absolute. Perhaps that is why certain traditions across the Near East speak of a teacher king who departed rather than died, a ruler who knew the cycles of the sky, the measure of rivers, the geometry of temples, and the strange rhythmic mathematics encoded in early cuneiform, a figure associated with wisdom, with setting foundations, and with watching from a great distance once his time among humans had concluded. These stories are scattered, fragmented, often dismissed as parallel inventions, but they converge just enough to raise a question. Why does the world remember an absence more clearly than a presence? It is tempting to imagine this figure as myth, Tempting too to imagine the king list as mere political fiction. Yet the problem remains: why did the earliest scribes insist on separating the world before the flood from the world after? Why preserve a boundary so absolute that even later dynasties respected it? Many cultures speak of a pre-cataclysmic age. Egypt with its Zep Tepi, India with its Yugas, the Levant with its Watchers. But in Sumer, this separation is documented with a precision that feels anomalous. If the flood is taken symbolically, the list becomes poetry. If taken literally, it suggests a restart of civilization of startling completeness. Geological evidence indicates significant sea level rise between 14,000 and 8,000 years ago, punctuated by sudden pulses that could devastate entire regions. The Black Sea flooding hypothesis once suggested an inundation around 5,600 BCE, though debated, while meltwater pulses at the end of the Younger Dryas are firmly established. Somewhere between natural catastrophe and mythic memory, a story survived, a story of something washed away and something that chose not to return. And yet Eridu rose, the temple of Enki, lord of the deep waters, keeper of wisdom, was built and rebuilt on the same sacred mound, over 17 times, each layer preserving an almost obsessive continuity in orientation and function. Why would a simple marsh settlement develop such precise architectural lineage? Why would early farmers and fishermen create a ritual epicenter aligned to astronomical cycles they had no practical reason to track so meticulously? Unless, of course, they inherited more than land. Unless they inherited memory, partial, fragile, and wrapped in reverence. The last Anunnaki king, if such a figure ever stood upon the plains of southern Mesopotamia, would have reigned during this liminal period when memory was turning to myth, when the flood, whether physical or symbolic, was erasing something older than human kingship, when knowledge carried from a previous age was fading into secrecy or scattering across new peoples and new geographies. The question is not whether such a being existed, but why the idea of him persisted so fiercely. It is difficult to imagine a civilization inventing a lineage of rulers with lifespans greater than entire historical eras, unless they were trying, in their own way, to preserve something they no longer had the vocabulary to fully describe. Consider the sudden emergence of advanced astronomical knowledge in early Sumer, the division of the sky into 3 paths, the enumeration of fixed stars, the calculation of lunar months with unsettling accuracy. These are not the products of a society just learning to farm. They suggest instruction, direct or inherited. And alongside this knowledge sits an equally puzzling emptiness. No transitional phases, no earlier experiments, no gradual refinement. A veil lies over the centuries before Eridu, and though archaeologists uncover pottery shards, charred seeds, and animal bones, the cognitive leap remains unaccounted for. Some researchers point to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a controversial proposal suggesting a cosmic event around 12,900 years ago triggered global fires and mass extinctions. Whether accepted or not, this period undeniably witnessed dramatic climatic shifts. Humanity, scattered in small groups, experienced a turbulence that could easily dissolve whole cultures, erase stories, and reset technologies. If an advanced society had existed before this upheaval, its remnants would be thin, fragile, survivable only through myth, symbol, and the faint muscle memory of techniques later civilizations would claim as their own. In this framework, the figure of the last Anunnaki king becomes less a literal sovereign and more a vessel of memory, a representation of the final inheritor of knowledge before the Great Break, a keeper of patterns, astronomical, architectural, agricultural, that would echo through millennia in unexpected places, in the cardinal alignments of temples, in the standardized weights that appear too suddenly, in the mythic archetypes repeating across continents. Yet even this explanation feels incomplete, because myths do not typically preserve details of measurement or specific city names or genealogical order. They preserve emotion, not structure, but the king list preserves structure with a precision that borders on defiance. Someone wanted that sequence known. Someone wanted the separation marked. There is a moment in the tablets where kingship is said to descend again after the flood, as though authority itself were not generated by humans, but delivered to them. The phrasing is chilling in its simplicity. It suggests a transfer, an initiation, or the return of a power that had briefly vanished. And then, almost without explanation, the lifespans collapse from tens of thousands of years to spans recognizable as mortal. It is as though a gate closed, as though the world's rules shifted. Archaeologists will argue these are metaphors. Historians will suggest political motives. Theologians will speak of divine narratives. Yet the lingering question remains untouched. Who first told the story? Who remembered the before time clearly enough to differentiate it from the after? The scribes of Sumer were not theorists. They were recorders of traditions much older than themselves. For a tale to survive that long, through invasions, droughts, and dynastic collapse, it must have been rooted in something felt as truth. And so we return to the quiet absence, to the sense that something once stood beside humanity, instructed it, guided it, then stepped back into shadow when the world reshaped itself. Every civilization that rises seems to carry traces of this same pattern. Teachers who depart, golden ages that end abruptly, knowledge that fades without being fully replaced. The pattern is too global to ignore, yet too faint to claim outright. Perhaps the last Anunnaki king was not a person at all, but a threshold. The final point at which an older world touched a newer one. A symbolic marker for the end of a forgotten epoch. Or perhaps he was exactly what the tablets imply. A sovereign of a time when the boundaries between myth and memory were not yet fixed. A figure whose departure humanity has never quite stopped grieving. The ruins of Eridu sit quiet now, half buried beneath sand and salt. The wind carries only the whisper of reeds, the low murmur of a desert that has swallowed countless secrets. But if one stands there long enough, as twilight stains the horizon and the air cools into that strange stillness unique to ancient places, it is difficult not to feel watched, gently, distantly, as though the memory of something once immense still lingers, waiting for those willing to notice. And beneath that quiet, another question glimmers, unresolved, asking itself through the centuries. What truly ended 13,000 years ago, and what began in its shadow? There is a point in the story where the landscape itself begins to feel complicit, as though the earth has been holding its breath for millennia, trying not to reveal what it once witnessed. When the threads of the past are drawn tight enough, they begin to vibrate against one another, and in that tremor, a different shape of history becomes faintly visible. Not the linear, careful narrative described in textbooks, but a palimpsest, a surface where each layer was written over another so completely that only faint outlines endure. And yet, even a faint outline can unsettle everything we think we know. After considering Eridu and the strange continuity of its sacred mound, another question rises like silt stirred in river water. How much of the world before the Sumerians was already old? And how much did they inherit that was not theirs to begin with? Archaeologists, for all their caution, admit that the origins of civilization appear too quickly, too strategically placed, too synchronized across distant regions. Sites that should have taken thousands of years of experimentation instead arrived nearly complete. Göbekli Tepe, with its massive T-pillars. Çatalhöyük, with complex symbolic art and advanced urban density. Mehrgar, with early dentistry and standardized bead production. The pre-dynastic Nile cultures that suddenly master irrigation. And then, almost as if on cue, Sumer appears, offering the world its first writing, its first cities, its first structured law. Patterns like these rarely emerge spontaneously without precursors, but the precursors remain hidden, erased perhaps or collapsed under catastrophic circumstances. And when something erases that much, that fast, it rarely acts gently. The end of the Pleistocene was a time of instability. Meltwater pulses surged into the oceans, coastlines shifted with startling speed, and the climate lurched from ice to warmth in mere generations. The Younger Dryas, that strange cold snap lasting over 1,000 years, ended with dramatic abruptness, around 11,600 years ago, a date that recurs curiously in multiple traditions. The Egyptian priests at Sais told Solon that their records of civilization stretch back to a similar epoch. Plato placed the destruction of Atlantis precisely then. The Zep Tepi, the first time of the gods, was said to have unfolded around that horizon. And in Sumer, the memory of antediluvian kings hovers just beyond measurable chronology, as though something profound occurred that humanity could sense, but not fully articulate. These convergences might be coincidence, or they might be the fossilized memory of a trauma so immense it fractured humanity's story into before and after. The flood narratives, which surface in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, India, China, the Americas, even the Aboriginal Dreamtime, may not recount the same event, but they echo the same shape. A world undone, knowledge scattered, survivors carrying shards of memory across continents. And in nearly all versions there is a teacher, a guide, a figure who prepares humanity for what comes next. The Sumerians called him Enki, the wise one. The Akkadians called him Ea. In some traditions he is the one who warns, instructs and chooses a human to preserve life. But when myth is stripped down to its bones, the figure begins to resemble something else, an intermediary between two worlds, a keeper of knowledge not holding it for himself, but passing it on at the moment when humanity stands on the threshold of forgetting. Perhaps this figure is the same presence remembered in other traditions under different names: the Egyptian Thoth, the Andean Viracocha, the Mesoamerican Quetzalcoatl, the Indian Manu's guide Matsya, the Hopi's Pahana, the Dogon's Nomo, each described as a bringer of knowledge, a restorer after a great loss, a being whose arrival and departure bookend a cycle of civilization. Cultures oceans apart spoke of similar stories long before cross-continental contact, and although their details diverge, their structure remains strangely consistent. Archaeologists prefer to explain this through psychological archetypes, shared cognitive patterns, common reactions to environmental catastrophe. Yet there is something stubborn in the symmetry of these accounts, something that resists being filed away as mere symbolism. Perhaps the archetypes were not invented, but inherited. And if inherited, from whom? The Sumerians were not vague about origins. They wrote with disarming clarity that kingship descended from heaven. That knowledge was given, that measures of time, fields, rituals, music, even the structure of temples were bestowed upon humanity, not developed through trial and error. This does not imply supernatural beings necessarily. It may suggest a lost civilization whose memory was so ancient that later cultures encoded it in divine language. To a Bronze Age scribe, any force that preceded the flood belonged to the realm of the divine simply because no other category existed for something that old. But the king list does something more. It does not merely place the earliest kings before the flood, it places them in an order. It measures their reigns, lists their seats of power, insists on continuity. Myth rarely cares for such precision. Myth breathes, shifts, distorts. But the king list records. Why? Some scholars propose that the list preserves a dim recollection of pre-flood settlements that once stretched across regions now buried under the Persian Gulf, whose coastline was vastly different before meltwater floods filled the basin. Underwater surveys have identified paleo-channels, old river systems that once flowed across a plain where communities could have thrived. If there were settlements there, their remains now lie submerged beneath layers of sediment, beyond the daily reach of archaeological excavation. The world we see on maps today did not always exist. The old shorelines tell a different story. Imagine a culture flourishing on that plain, one that tracked lunar cycles, charted stars, mastered water management, and developed early symbolic systems. A society erased not by time but by rising seas that crept inland year after year until the memory of life along the vanished rivers became myth. Those who fled inland may have carried fragments of tradition, a structured sense of kingship, a cosmology tied to star cycles, a reverence for beings who governed epochs rather than human lifetimes. These fragments, once re-established in places like Eridu, would become the seeds of Sumer. If so, the last Anunnaki king may represent the final leader of that lost coastal civilization, the last custodian of knowledge before the waters claimed their world. His reign would not be measured in literal millennia, but in the memory of a long-enduring age. When survivors retold their story generations later, when lifespans shortened and the world became harsher, the numbers may have transformed into symbols of endurance, into mythic arithmetic that conveyed greatness through magnitude. And yet even this interpretation carries a shadow. because the Sumerians did not speak of these rulers solely as cultural memories. They described them as beings of extraordinary stature, wisdom, and longevity, distinct from humans. Was this metaphor, political flattery, or a memory of encounters with a group far more advanced than later societies could comprehend? History is full of moments when technologically superior cultures appear as divine to those they meet. Yet the earliest Mesopotamian stories do not carry the tone of meeting strangers. They carry the tone of remembering ancestors whose nature has become blurred by time. There is another layer to this, hidden not in texts but in alignments. Many early Sumerian temples appear oriented towards specific celestial points, and the earliest ziggurats echo astronomical design long before such precision should have existed. Eridu's temple sequence seems to follow a rhythm, tied not merely to ritual needs but to the cycles of the sky. The Sumerians divided the heavens into three paths: Enlil, Anu, and Enki, an organisational system that may reflect an inheritance from an older astronomical tradition. Their star catalogues, though incomplete, hint at observations far older than their writing system. Such sophistication suggests continuity, not invention. A lineage of knowledge, a memory of the sky preserved through upheaval. If the last Anunnaki king presided during the final phase of this lineage, his story may be imprinted in the architecture of the early world rather than its texts. Stone and clay remember differently than language. They hold silence without distortion, and in that silence, one can sense that the earliest builders of the first cities were not beginning something new. They were restoring something remembered. Yet even the most resilient memory fades when confronted with catastrophe. Around 6200 BCE, the 8.2 kiloyear event brought rapid cooling and drought across the Near East. Earlier still, around 10,800 BCE, the world plunged into the Younger Dryas with brutal suddenness. These were not small disturbances. They were global shocks capable of erasing entire ways of life. If a once thriving society fell during one such event, only traces filtered into later civilizations. Those traces, once stretched across millennia, become mythic beings with impossibly long reigns and half-remembered technologies. And there is the unsettling possibility that whatever knowledge survived was deliberately fragmented. Some cultures speak of wisdom that was hidden to prevent misuse. Others speak of knowledge that humanity was not ready to handle after the fall of earlier ages. Whether these are symbolic warnings or vestiges of real practices, they raise the same quiet question. What does it mean for a civilization to guard knowledge rather than display it? Perhaps the last Anunnaki king chose silence, not disappearance. Perhaps he entrusted fragments to different peoples, knowing that dispersal offered greater survival than concentration. Myths across the world speak of knowledge bearers who travel, figures who emerge from the sea, from the desert, from the mountains, always carrying teachings that feel strangely similar. Was this convergence coincidence, or the ripple of a deliberate act of memory preservation? Yet if preservation was intended, then what erased the rest? What was so powerful that even temple alignments, star catalogues, and sacred genealogies could not fully protect the story? Environmental collapse explains much, human conflict explains more. But there is another force more subtle: time's indifference to clarity. Over thousands of years, even the most carefully transmitted tradition phrase, words change, meanings blur, names merge, and eventually myth replaces memory, simply because memory cannot survive intact without a context to anchor it. Still, the Sumerians anchored their memory as best they could. They carved the king list. They rebuilt their temples with precise orientation. They preserved their rituals even when their cities fell. They held on to the notion that kingship was a trust, a gift handed down from a world before theirs. This was not blind belief. It was remembrance. The figure of the last Anunnaki king emerges here not as a mythic overlord, but as a symbol of the final moment of coherence before the great forgetting. His departure marks the start of an age where humanity would build, innovate, struggle, and rise on its own, but always with the faint sensation that something essential was missing. And perhaps that missing piece is the thread that draws us back to these stories thousands of years later. Perhaps it is why we still feel a twinge of recognition when we encounter myths of golden ages, teacher kings and civilizations ending abruptly. Some part of the human psyche remembers what the historical record cannot hold. The world today carries the quiet remnants of that older story in its landscapes, in submerged coastlines, in ancient riverbeds hidden beneath the Gulf, in enigmatic ruins perched on hilltops or buried under tell mounds. These are not answers, they are echoes. And in following them, we are not seeking proof but resonance, traces of a rhythm too old to measure, but too persistent to vanish. Somewhere in that rhythm, the figure of the last Anunnaki king still lingers, not as a ruler seated on a throne, but as a marker of a threshold the world crossed before memory could follow, a reminder of an age that ended so completely that its outlines survive only in myth, and yet not completely enough to disappear. And as the dust settles on these thoughts, another uncertainty slides into view, still unclaimed, still unanswered. If a civilization could vanish so thoroughly once, what prevents such a disappearance from happening again? There are stretches of history where the traces grow faint, not because nothing happened, but because too much did. Moments when the world reshaped itself so violently that memory scattered like ash on the wind, leaving behind only fragments, symbols, rituals, half-remembered names. And in those fragments, if one listens with enough patience, a very old story begins to murmur. Not in full sentences, but in impressions like the lingering warmth of a fire long extinguished. It is in this space, between silence and remembrance, that the search for the last Anunnaki king becomes something deeper than curiosity. It becomes a way of sensing the outline of a forgotten world. After the floods and climatic shocks that reshaped the early Holocene, humanity began stitching itself back together across new landscapes. Fresh riverbeds carved themselves into soft sediment. Coastlines stabilized. Glaciers retreated into distant mountains that now felt impossibly far from the plains. In these new environments, people built again. First shelters, then villages, then with surprising speed, spiritual centers and communal complexes that seemed too coordinated for their time. As if the knowledge to build them did not originate in those new settlements, but had travelled inside the people themselves. Old techniques carried in fragile memory. The traces of that older knowledge appear not only in monumental sites like Göbekli Tepe, but also in less grand places where subtle precision reveals itself. In the early irrigation channels of the Zagros foothills, in the symmetrical obsidian blades found hundreds of kilometres from their volcanic sources, in the mysterious alignment of habitation mounds that seem to follow a pattern not dictated merely by convenience. These patterns do not shout, they whisper, but the whisper is persistent, and it draws attention to a question often avoided. Why did the earliest post-glacial societies possess organisation, artistry, and cosmological awareness far exceeding what their supposed developmental stage should allow? The Sumerians, centuries later, would attribute such leaps to the gods who established order after the upheaval. But underneath the divine language lies a sense of inheritance, an acknowledgement that the knowledge they possessed was older than their cities, older than their writing, older even than the myths used to explain it. In their tablets they wrote of a time when kingship first descended upon Eridu. But the notion of descent may reflect not heavenly intervention, but the arrival or re-establishment of an older cultural tradition. Whatever its origin, the Sumerians treated it with reverence. They seem almost apologetic about the limits of their understanding, as though they were custodians of something whose depth they could no longer fully grasp. This act of custodianship becomes more intriguing when we consider their early texts describing the me, objects or principles embodying the functions of civilization. Rulership, wisdom, craftsmanship, writing, music, truth, judgment, even fear and serenity. They are described as gifts, taken from one realm and delivered to humanity. Although later mythologized, the concept of me feels like the memory of institutional knowledge once held in tangible form. Perhaps tablets, perhaps coded sequences of ritual and practical instruction. To call them divine decrees was perhaps the only way ancient people could frame something that felt both powerful and inherited. If the last Anunnaki king existed as a figure within this framework, he may have been remembered as the final bearer of the me before the dissolution of the older world. Someone whose authority derived not from domination, but from stewardship of culturally foundational knowledge. When the flood, or whatever cataclysm the myths refer to, swept across the old lands, the custodian would either have perished or chosen to relinquish his role, leaving humanity to navigate the new world without returning to the old ways. But the curious thing about memory is that it does not vanish evenly. It clings to symbols, to gestures, to rituals repeated unconsciously. Across early Mesopotamia, the act of rebuilding temples on the same sacred spot over and over suggests a longing for continuity. Each new structure echoed the orientation of the previous one. Each layer preserved the shape of the one below. This was not mere tradition. It was devotion to an origin that felt larger than any individual generation. The temple of Enki at Eridu exemplifies this. Beneath the final mound lie dozens of rebuildings, each almost ritualistically aligned. Archaeologists note that the earliest levels already show sophistication, an understanding of sacred space, proportion, and ceremonial layout. There is no naive beginning. There is only remembrance. The city's very foundation seems to pulse with the sense of recreating something older, something that belonged to a world just beyond reach. Some researchers have speculated that Eridu may preserve the echo of a submerged civilization once located along the now drowned river valleys of the Gulf Basin. Before sea levels rose, this region was a fertile plain, crisscrossed by rivers flowing from Mesopotamia into the open Gulf. Settlements along these rivers, if they existed, would now lie beneath meters of sediment. The Sumerians themselves spoke of cities before theirs, swallowed by water or forgotten by time. Their oldest myths locate the origin of wisdom not in their visible world, but in the Absu, the deep waters beneath the earth, or in a more literal sense, the submerged lands beyond their southern horizon. The Absu, in this light, becomes more than a mythic underworld. It becomes a memory of drowned homelands. And its ruler, Enki, the wise, the engineer, the keeper of secrets, could represent the archetype of a leader from that lost realm. The last Anunnaki king, therefore, may not refer to a divine being, but to the final sovereign of that submerged society, mythologized generations later by people who could feel the weight of their inheritance, but no longer knew its source. This interpretation grows more evocative when we consider that many early myths describe the bearers of knowledge as emerging from the sea. Oans in Babylonian lore, clad in the form of a fishman, arrived from the waters and bestowed civilization to humans. The Dogons speak of the Nomo, amphibious beings who descended upon the earth with teachings. The Andean Viracocha emerged from the lake to instruct mankind. Even in Greece, the earliest philosophers traced their wisdom to figures who came from the watery edges of the known world. These parallels need not imply the literal existence of amphibious beings. Rather, they may encode a shared memory of teachers arriving from coastal or island regions erased by rising seas. When one traces these myths back far enough, they begin to resemble the cultural trauma of displacement, stories of people who fled their drowned homelands and arrived in new territories bearing knowledge that seemed miraculous. If this is the case, then the last Anunnaki king becomes not a figure of cosmic authority, but a symbol of finality, a representation of the last intact leadership of that older culture, before it fractured into refugee groups spreading across Eurasia, Africa, and possibly beyond. Each group carried fragments, astronomical systems, ceremonial traditions, architectural principles, oral histories. Over centuries, these fragments evolved into distinct cultural expressions, but their shared core hints at an underlying unity. Archaeology has long struggled with this pattern. The diffusion of megalithic construction, the sudden appearance of precise astronomical alignments, the recurrence of similar cosmological symbols across thousands of kilometers, all pose questions that resist simple explanations. Independent invention is possible, but the synchrony suggests something more interconnected. It suggests that the memory of the pre-flood world, fragmented as it was, remained potent enough to shape new civilizations in surprisingly consistent ways. In Mesopotamia, the echoes are especially strong. Early cuneiform tablets record not only myth but measurement, carefully calculated ratios, lunar calendars, star lists, and numerical systems that appear abruptly, as though copied from an older schema. The sexagesimal system, with its base 60 divisions, is an oddity in human mathematics. Yet it appears fully formed. Why 60? Why such a complex structure so early? Some researchers proposed that it reflects astronomical cycles tracked by earlier cultures. Others suggest practical trade origins. But the suddenness of its adoption leaves room for deeper speculation. The idea that this system belonged to a lineage of knowledge predating the Sumerians. If so, then the last Anunnaki king may be connected not only to myth and kingship, but to mathematics, to the preservation of a system that encoded essential patterns of time and space. Perhaps he did not rule from a palace, but from a cultural tradition that measured the world in ways later generations only dimly understood. But every lineage, no matter how robust, eventually fades when the world around it changes faster than memory can adjust. Around the late 4th millennium BCE, the climate of southern Mesopotamia began to shift. Increased aridity, soil salinization, and the unpredictable flooding of rivers placed pressure on early settlements. These stresses may have contributed to the abandonment and relocation of temples, the reorganization of city-states, and the political upheavals that punctuated Sumerian history. As environmental conditions deteriorated, so too did the clarity of inherited knowledge. Rituals continued, but their meanings blurred. Cosmological systems persisted, but their origins became mythic. The king list, compiled much later, attempts to anchor these remnants in a structure. But the deeper logic behind that structure was already fading. This fading is perhaps most evident in the way the Sumerians struggled to reconcile their ancestral stories with their lived reality. They revered the ancient kings as beings of immense longevity, yet no human ruler matched those lifespans. They spoke of divine realms, yet their daily existence was steeped in the pragmatics of agriculture, trade, and conflict. This dissonance suggests that the myths were not created to explain the world, but to remember something that no longer fit within it. The last Anunnaki king occupies this tension. He is the link between a world that no longer existed and a world that struggled to recall its origins. He stands at the threshold of forgetting, a figure whose significance was immense in memory, yet enigmatic in interpretation. To later scribes, he was a divine king. To those who lived through the transition, he may have been a leader who chose not to rebuild the old world because the old world had become impossible. As centuries passed, his story softened into legend. His identity dissolved into archetype. His role became symbolic, a reminder of a time when kingship was not merely political, but cosmological, tied to the rhythms of the sky, the movements of water, and the cycles of ages. And in that symbolism lies an eerie continuity. No matter how the myths changed, the sense of a lost age persisted, an age of harmony, knowledge, and connection to forces larger than human ambition. This memory haunted the Sumerians. It haunted Egypt. It haunted Greece. It haunted nearly every culture with a tradition of primordial rulers. And it haunts us still, because the questions they carried remain unresolved. We walk through museums, stare at ancient tablets, read translated myths, yet feel the same faint tug toward an epoch we cannot fully articulate. Something inside the human psyche recognizes the silhouette of a lost world, even if it cannot name it. Perhaps that is why the idea of the last Anunnaki king resonates. He stands not as a historical figure to be proven or disproven, but as a representation of the moment humanity lost its direct connection to an older order, a moment when knowledge became memory, memory became myth, and myth became a whisper across time. And as that whisper threads through the ruins, through the star-aligned temples, through the submerged riverbeds of forgotten plains, it leaves behind one more unsettled thought, soft but persistent, drifting like a question half-formed at the edge of sleep. If the world once held a deeper truth, what part of it still waits beneath the silence? There are epochs in human memory that seem to dissolve the closer one approaches them, like sand slipping through the fingers. What remains are shadows, patterns repeating across cultures that never met, symbols etched into stone long before any written alphabet, and stories so old that they resemble dreams more than history. Yet it is precisely in these dreams that the pulse of something ancient lingers, something that suggests humanity once stood closer to the threshold of a world it no longer remembers. And in the dim outline of that forgotten threshold, the figure of the last Anunnaki king appears again, not in grandeur, but in the silence between fragments. After tracing the submerged plains and the whispered memories of a drowned lineage, a new layer of the mystery begins to unfold, the strange persistence of knowledge that seems older than the civilizations who preserved it. The Sumerians, for all their brilliance, were not gradual inventors. They inherited fully formed systems, writing, mathematics, irrigation engineering, astronomical frameworks that appear suddenly as though transplanted from elsewhere. Scholars debate the origin of this abrupt emergence, pointing to trade routes, environmental pressures, or local innovation. But none of these fully explain the scale of the cognitive leap. Something else, something older, seems to shimmer beneath the surface of their achievements. To understand this inheritance, one must look beyond Mesopotamia, into regions where other remnants of forgotten knowledge survived. In the high plateaus of Anatolia, the enclosures of Göbekli Tepe stand as silent witnesses to a capability that should not have existed so early. Carved pillars arranged in precise circles, decorated with animals, rendered with uncanny anatomical knowledge. The builders of this site were hunter-gatherers, nomadic without pottery, without metallurgy, yet they displayed an understanding of geometry, symbolism, and organised labour that challenges all conventional models of societal development. It is as if they too were remembering rather than inventing. In Egypt, the pre-dynastic cultures of the Nile Valley appear with similar suddenness. Long before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before even the earliest hieroglyphs, there existed maritime peoples whose boats, depicted on pottery and tomb walls, were capable of navigating deep waters. Their iconography shows standards, crowns, and ritual processions that resemble structures that would later re-emerge fully in the dynastic era. Archaeologists call these proto-cultures, but the term only obscures the fact that the foundations of their civilization arrived too quickly, as though guided by a blueprint older than the valley itself. In the Indus Valley, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro rise with planned streets, drainage systems, standardized bricks, and weights so precise they rival modern engineering. Yet their writing remains undeciphered, their origins unclear, their connection to older traditions mysterious. Their collapse too is shrouded, somewhere between drought, river shifts, and social complexity. But there is no linear build-up. They appear, flourish, and vanish with a rhythm, echoing the same pattern found in Sumer. Across the early world, the beginnings are too sharp, too defined, as if humanity was reconstructing from memory rather than discovering anew. The Sumerians spoke of the me, codes of civilization delivered to humanity in a moment of transition. Egyptian priests spoke of the Netjeru, arriving in a time before time, guiding the first kings. The Dogon recalled that their ancestors were taught by beings who emerged from the water. The Maya spoke of past epochs destroyed and rebuilt. The Greeks told of ages of gold, silver, bronze, and heroes, each ending in rupture. The recurrence of this structure suggests something universal, a memory of cycles, of destructions, of restorations. And in those cycles, a figure or lineage always appears: a teacher, a king, a guide, someone who stands at the threshold between ages. The last Anunnaki king fits into this pattern, not necessarily as a singular being, but as the symbolic endpoint of a lineage that carried knowledge across the great divide between worlds, the pre-cataclysmic world and the world we know. To trace this lineage further, one must descend into the mythology surrounding antediluvian knowledge, and how it was hidden. Ancient texts across the Near East speak of wisdom preserved before the flood. In Mesopotamia, the story of Atrahasis describes instructions given to save life and knowledge. In Jewish mysticism, Enoch is said to have recorded secrets on tablets before being taken away. In Islamic tradition, Idris, often associated with Enoch, is credited with early sciences. In Egypt, Thoth was said to have written books of knowledge and hidden them beneath temples. The Mandaeans speak of a pre-flood figure who safeguarded cosmic teachings. These traditions do not originate from a single source, yet they share the same motif: wisdom safeguarded against a world-ending event. The question then is not whether such knowledge existed, but what form it took, and who was entrusted with it. In the Sumerian worldview, the guardians of transformative knowledge belong to the Anunnaki, those who came down, or those of royal seed. The term has been misinterpreted in modern popular culture, but in ancient texts, it denotes a group associated with order, measurement, and cosmic cycles. They are not omnipotent gods, not creators of the universe, but intermediaries, figures who maintain the structure of the world, who set boundaries, assign destinies, and oversee transitions. If one strips away the later mythologizing, the Anunnaki begin to resemble a class of priest-kings or sages from an earlier epoch, bearers of knowledge accumulated over long spans of stability. Their descent could refer to the migration of elite groups from coastal or island civilizations into inland settlements after rising seas. Their ascent could mark the moment they withdrew, leaving younger societies to govern themselves. Within this interpretation, the last Anunnaki king becomes the final bearer of a unified tradition before it fragmented. His story, therefore, would not be about authority, but about loss, an endpoint marked not by violence, but by relinquishment. To understand why such relinquishment might occur, one must consider the context of the early Holocene. Between 13,000 and 7,000 years ago, humanity endured enormous transformations: ecological, geological, and cultural. Meltwater floods reshaped continents. The climate swung between extremes. Inland seas formed. Coastlines moved hundreds of kilometers. Animal extinctions forced the reorganization of hunting societies. And as stability returned, so did complexity, but in new forms. A society that had thrived in the stability of the late Pleistocene would not necessarily survive the turbulence of the younger Dryas. Its institutions might collapse. Its population might scatter. Its knowledge keepers might be forced to choose between preservation and adaptation. If the last Anunnaki king existed as a leader during this upheaval, his role may have been one of transition, guiding the survivors into a world that would no longer sustain the structures of the past. There are subtle hints in Mesopotamian myth that acknowledge this. The figure of Enki is often portrayed not as a ruler, but as a strategist, someone who adapts to crises, who finds solutions when others cling to old patterns. He warns, he advises, he intervenes to preserve life, not order. If this figure reflects a memory of the last leader of the old world, his story may encode the emotional truth of that moment, a reluctant surrendering of a civilization's grandeur in exchange for the survival of its knowledge. This emotional truth appears in the architecture too. At Eridu, the earliest temples are small, modest structures, spaces of guidance rather than dominion. But as centuries pass, the temples grow larger, more elaborate, more hierarchical. The shift mirrors the transition from a world led by knowledge holders to one led by power holders. The temple that might once have been a council house for sages becomes, over time, the seat of institutional authority. Beneath this transition lies the ache of forgetting. Civilization flourished, but memory dimmed. The king list itself seems to lament this. Its impossible lifespans may not be exaggerations, but metaphors, measuring eras rather than individuals. Its sequence may encode phases of stability before the flood. Its abrupt shortening of rains after the flood may represent not biology, but the compression of memory, the collapse of an age into myth. If the last Anunnaki king represents the end of the final phase before the collapse, his departure marks the moment when humanity stepped into history, a realm of shorter rhythms, faster cycles, and increasing distance from the primordial world. Yet the most haunting aspect of this transition is not the loss itself, but the residue it left behind. In nearly every ancient culture, there exists a fascination with restoring, remembering, or reconnecting with the older age. The Egyptians attempted to align their monuments with celestial markers older than their own civilization. The Vedic texts describe rituals meant to echo cosmic cycles believed to predate humanity. The Greeks fashioned philosophies striving to restore a golden age of harmony. The Sumerians rebuilt Eridu's temple again and again, as if trying to anchor themselves to something slipping away. It is in these acts of restoration that the shadow of the last Anunnaki king lingers most strongly, not as a physical ruler, but as a gravitational centre around which all remembering revolves. His kingship, whether literal or symbolic, becomes a metaphor for the coherence humanity longs for, but no longer possesses. There are inscriptions from later periods that speak of forgotten wisdom buried beneath the sands, of lost tablets containing the plans of heaven and earth, of rituals whose meanings were no longer understood, even by the priests who performed them. These are not the writings of naive people inventing myths. They are the laments of cultures, aware that something had slipped beyond their grasp. Perhaps that is why the story of an ancient lineage of kings, culminating in a final sovereign, persists so stubbornly through time. It speaks to a psychological wound, the wound of disconnection from origins. The flood, whether literal or symbolic, shattered continuity. The survivors rebuilt, but the thread connecting them to their past frayed until it broke. And yet the memory of that thread remains. It hides in alignments, in myths, in the eerie synchronicities of ancient cosmologies. It hides in the way humanity continues to seek meaning, in the sky, in the earth, in the rhythm of cycles beyond comprehension. It hides in our fascination with what came before history, before writing, before the world was divided into eras and dynasties. The last Anunnaki king, then, is not simply a being of myth. He is the embodiment of a fracture, the guardian of a door that closed, quietly, irrevocably, between one world and the next. And as long as that door remains closed, his shadow stretches across the millennia as an unfinished sentence. In the quiet of that unfinished sentence, another thought emerges, soft yet lingering. If a door once closed, could it open again? There comes a moment, when tracing the faint lines of forgotten ages, that the landscape of history begins to resemble a palimpsest, written by unsteady hands. Layers of memory overlap, bleed into one another, and fracture along seams we can barely perceive. Yet through these fractures, something older than recorded civilization continues to flicker, an inheritance that humanity never entirely understood, only repeated like a ritual whose meaning had long been lost. And in that flicker, the silhouette of the last Anunnaki king shifts once more, not as a ruler confined to a single city or tablet, but as an echo reverberating across thousands of years of human longing. After passing through the drowned plains, the fragmented traditions, and the symbolic lineage of forgotten sages, the inquiry begins to shift. It deepens. For if memory can be carried in myth and architecture, can it also survive in something subtler? Something that moves through the human mind like a pattern of intuition? How does a civilization that no longer remembers its origins still behave as though guided by remnants of those origins? The strange consistency of sacred numbers across ancient cultures suggests an answer. The Sumerian base 60 system, Egyptian cycles of 36 decans, the Vedic emphasis on 108, the Mesoamerican count of 260, all appearing independently, all tied to astronomical observations, and all pointing toward a deeper awareness of time coded into ritual. These numbers are not random. They reflect relationships between lunar months, solar years, precessional cycles, and the rhythms of celestial bodies. For societies newly risen from the trauma of cataclysm, such precision should have taken centuries to develop. Instead, it appears ready-made, as though it were a preserved inheritance. The question, then, is not how ancient peoples discovered these patterns, but how they remembered them. Some point to long-term observation, others to practical necessities of agriculture. Yet those explanations cannot fully account for the sudden coherence of these systems across vast distances. The more one examines the earliest civilizations, the more a strange familiarity emerges. It is as if they were speaking dialects of the same forgotten language, one composed not of words but of measurements, alignments and cosmic rhythms. This forgotten language lies at the heart of the mystery surrounding the last Anunnaki king. For if he represents the end of an ancestral knowledge lineage, his story is woven not only into myths, but into the very patterns humanity continued to replicate, unconsciously. Consider the world's earliest monumental sites, each appearing long before the societies that built them reached their supposed developmental thresholds. Their alignments track solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, and stellar risings with startling accuracy. Across continents, structures from a deep past, many predating agriculture, are built with astronomical precision that should have required mathematical systems yet to be invented. Göbekli Tepe's pillars frame specific stars. Nabta Playa aligns with the movement of Orion and Sirius. The cairns of Scotland capture lunar cycles. The oldest mounds of North America reflect solstice patterns. In Peru, the ancient lines of the desert trace geometric relationships barely distinguishable from precessional markers. In Egypt, The orientation of early temples mirrors celestial arcs that span thousands of years. And in Mesopotamia, the earliest ziggurats echo the same alignment logic that appears in cultures half a world away. These are not coincidences, they are echoes of a worldview in which earth and sky formed a unified system, a system inherited, not invented. And if inherited, it must have been preserved through a lineage of knowledge keepers, a lineage that the Sumerians later remembered as the Anunnaki. The last of these keepers, if he existed, would have lived during the final era when humanity still held a clear memory of this cosmic system. His title, king, may be misleading. Perhaps he was less a ruler than a custodian of a worldview that defined time itself through cycles vast enough to dwarf human lifespans. The king list's impossible reigns, then, may reflect epochs, not individuals, measured ages, not biological longevity. His departure would mark the moment when humanity shifted from cosmic time to human time, from cycles of the heavens to cycles of politics, agriculture, and war. The shift is evident in how early civilizations evolved. Their first monumental structures were aligned to the sky, later ones were aligned to power. Something was lost along the way, something no single culture could restore, though many tried. Egypt with its stellar temples, India with its Vedic astronomy, Greece with its pre-Socratic cosmology, the Maya with their long counts. All echoed an older structure none fully understood. If one examines how myth mirrors this loss, a pattern emerges. In nearly every tradition, there is a moment when the gods withdraw, a moment when knowledge dims, a moment when humanity is left to navigate without guidance. In Mesopotamia, the withdrawal comes after the flood, when the Anunnaki retreat to their divine realms and leave kingship to mortals. In Egypt, the gods depart after a golden age, leaving the world to pharaohs who can only approximate their predecessors. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl departs by sea, promising one day to return. In Andean tradition, Viracocha walks into the water and disappears. In Greece, the end of the Age of Heroes marks the fading of divine presence. The withdrawal motif is nearly universal, Antied Maiwe. It reflects not a physical departure, but a cognitive one, a loss of access to an older worldview. This loss is often described not as a punishment, but as a necessary transition. Humanity, after trauma, must rebuild on its own terms. The last Anunnaki king then becomes the symbol of a final turning point. But why did this turning point occur? Why did the knowledge lineage end? Some explanations lie in environmental collapse, the Younger Dryas ending abruptly, meltwater pulses flooding coastal civilizations, droughts fracturing inland societies. Others lie in population dispersal, small groups carrying fragments of knowledge, unable to maintain the full system. Still others suggest something more complex, that the knowledge was deliberately veiled. Ancient traditions speak of secrets hidden from those unprepared to wield them. The Egyptians claimed the most sacred books of Thoth were kept from the uninitiated. The Mesopotamians wrote of tablets of destiny, accessible only to a select few. The Vedic texts describe knowledge transmitted orally to prevent distortion. Many shamanic traditions speak of wisdom, meant only for those who have crossed specific thresholds of understanding. These echoes hint at a practice of protecting knowledge not out of greed, but out of caution. Civilizations recovering from catastrophe may have been deemed too unstable to hold the full inheritance. Thus, the lineage of keepers may have restricted access, preserving only fragments. In this light, the last Anunnaki king becomes a guardian of secrets he chose not to pass fully to the next age. Not out of fear, but out of recognition that the world had changed too much for that knowledge to survive intact. One sees the shadow of this decision in the way early civilizations approached time. The Sumerians tracked celestial cycles but gradually simplified their calendar. The Egyptians preserved precessional alignments but shifted towards solar rituals. The Indus Valley built cities with cosmic geometry, but left no surviving texts explaining their logic. The Maya encoded cycles of vast duration, but later dynasties lost access to earlier calculations. Knowledge became fragmented, ritual replaced comprehension, structure replaced meaning. And in this fragmentation, one finds the faint outline of the king's departure, a final act of relinquishment. Yet his shadow persists, not as a person, but as a pattern a pattern embedded so deeply into human consciousness that it resurfaces again and again whenever civilizations seek to understand their origins. It resurfaces in Plato's story of Atlantis, a civilization destroyed by forces beyond its control, remembered only through echoes. It resurfaces in the Vedic concept of yugas, ages cycling through creation and destruction. It resurfaces in the Hopi tablets describing worlds destroyed and remade. It resurfaces in the myths of the Pacific, from Rapa Nui to Polynesia, speaking of lost homelands beneath the sea. It resurfaces in the Aboriginal stories of lands drowned by rising waters at the end of the last ice age, preserved orally for thousands of years. Across the world, people remember an age of knowledge, an age of harmony with the sky, an age that ended abruptly. This is not coincidence. This is a memory trace. Perhaps it is the only remaining piece of what the last Anunnaki king safeguarded before his lineage dissolved. As one follows this memory trace deeper, another layer appears: the mysterious relationship between sound, vibration, and sacred architecture. Archaeologists have observed that many ancient structures exhibit unique acoustic properties, resonances tuned to specific frequencies. The hypogeum of Malta resonates at precisely 111 Hz. Göbekli Tepe's enclosures amplify low tones. Egyptian chambers magnify sound waves in ways that seem engineered. Even Sumerian temples reveal traces of sound manipulation. These resonances may reflect a worldview in which sound was not symbolic but functional, part of the same cosmic language encoded in numbers and alignments. If the last Anunnaki king was a custodian of such a system, then his lineage may have transmitted not only astronomical knowledge, but acoustic understanding as well. And this raises an even deeper possibility that the forgotten world was not defined by technological prowess alone, but by a mode of perception different from our own. A way of relating to the cosmos not through abstraction, but through direct experience, through sound, rhythm, alignment, and ritual synchronization with natural cycles. When that mode of perception was lost, humanity gained history, but lost something more subtle. A way of knowing that cannot be reconstructed through archaeology, because it lived not in objects but in consciousness. Perhaps the last Anunnaki king was the final master of that worldview, a worldview that dissolved with him, leaving only its traces in myth and stone. But if this worldview existed, why does it call to us still? Why does it stir something deep within when we encounter ancient ruins, lost languages, forgotten alignments? Why does the idea of a primordial age evoke not fear, but recognition? Perhaps because some part of us remembers. Not as fact, but as resonance. Not as knowledge, but as intuition. This intuition is subtle. It reveals itself in the human desire to rebuild lost harmonies, through music, philosophy, architecture, astronomy. It reveals itself in our fascination with origins, with cycles, with mysteries that defy linear explanation. It reveals itself in the persistent sense that something is missing from the story we tell about ourselves. In this sense, the last Anunnaki king is not only a figure of the past, he is a mirror held up to the present, a reminder of the distance between what humanity once knew and what it has since forgotten. And yet, even as this distance widens, the whisper continues, the same whisper that surfaces in myths, temples, numbers, alignments. A whisper that feels like a memory just out of reach, waiting in the quiet spaces between the known and the unknowable. In that whisper lies a lingering uncertainty, delicate, unresolved, and suspended at the edge of perception. If something ancient once guided humanity, what part of its message still echoes beneath the noise of our present age? There is a peculiar quality to the oldest stories, an undertone that does not fade, even when the words themselves have been reshaped by centuries of retelling. It is not the content of the tale that endures, but the feeling beneath it, as though something once known continues to hum inside the human mind, vibrating faintly across generations. When following the thread of the last Anunnaki king, this undertone becomes impossible to ignore. It appears in places where no tablets survive, in symbols that predate writing, in alignments older than any temple, and in a kind of memory that does not belong solely to one people, but to the species itself. As the post-glacial world stabilized, humanity began to settle into patterns that would eventually form the first civilizations. Yet the rate of change between 12,000 and 5,000 years ago remains one of the great enigmas of human history. Something accelerated, something awakened. The archaeological record shows a thunderous escalation. From nomadic bands to organized settlements, from simple dwellings to monumental enclosures, from oral traditions to complex symbolic systems, all within the span of a few dozen generations. By every measure, the shift was too abrupt, too coordinated, too reminiscent of a blueprint rediscovered. The question is not whether this acceleration occurred, but what catalyzed it. Most mainstream explanations point to climate stability, abundant resources, and population growth. These factors mattered, of course, yet they seem insufficient to explain the depth of transformation. Stability creates opportunity, but opportunity alone does not spontaneously generate complex cosmologies, ceremonial architecture, and encoded astronomical knowledge. Nor does it account for the eerie similarities between early sacred sites scattered across the world, all reflecting an orientation toward the heavens. There is a whisper within this similarity, a suggestion that the oldest builders were not learning but remembering. And if they were remembering, what exactly had been forgotten? The figure of the last Anunnaki king emerges again here, not as a literal monarch, but as the embodiment of a vanished epistemology, a way of understanding the world that was once coherent, passed from generation to generation, and then silenced by catastrophe. The king becomes a metaphor for the final convergence point of that knowledge, the last custodian before the lineage dissolved into the fragmented traditions we now call myth. To trace this dissolution more deeply, one must consider the earliest evidence of symbolic cognition after the Ice Age. Cave paintings in Europe and Asia exhibit geometric motifs that reappear thousands of years later in Neolithic art. Spirals, grids, rays, dots, and serpent-like patterns associated with altered states of consciousness. These motifs may reflect a universal human connection to cosmic cycles, encoded through ritual, but they may also represent an inheritance from an older tradition, one that did not survive into the agricultural era intact. This inheritance becomes clearer when examining the world's earliest megalithic structures. Across continents, civilizations that should have had no contact with one another erected stone circles, pyramids, mounds, cairns, alignments, and enclosures with geometrical precision. These constructions appear independently, yet their architectural logic often mirrors one another. Stones aligned to solstices, chambers resonating at harmonic frequencies, pathways guiding sound waves, skies mapped onto earth. Göbekli Tepe, Stonehenge, Nabta Playa, Gunung Padang, the dolmens of Korea, the mounds of North America, the pyramids of Egypt and Sudan, the stepped structures in Peru, all share a language of orientation that suggests a common origin, too ancient for any recorded culture to explain. The builders of these places were not novices. They carried templates, metaphors, and principles older than their settlements. Some researchers propose that these early structures represent the earliest form of a worldwide archaic science, a non-technological yet sophisticated system rooted in experiential observation of the cosmos. In this system, the earth and sky were understood as mirrors, time as cyclical, and human consciousness as a participant in cosmic rhythms. If such a system existed, the last Anunnaki king may have been its final master. His departure, then, signifies more than the fall of a dynasty. It represents the collapse of an intellectual tradition so ancient that later civilizations mistook it for divine. When the king vanished, whether in myth or memory, the knowledge he carried fractured. The fragments spread like seeds on the wind, taking root in new lands with new interpretations. Over time, these fragments hardened into rituals, myths, and symbolic cosmologies. This pattern of fragmentation appears with unsettling regularity. In Mesopotamia, the Mi became ritual objects whose meanings were no longer fully understood. In Egypt, the Hermetic texts described lost books buried beneath temples. In India, the Vedas lament a knowledge that grows dim with each passing age. In China, the mandate of heaven becomes thinner with each dynasty. Among the Maori, the earliest chants refer to a time when humans and celestial beings interacted openly, In the Americas, stories of gods departing across the sea speak of a severed link. These laments echo one another. They point toward a collective awareness that something foundational slipped beyond reach. To understand this slipping, one must consider the profound and psychological impact of the cataclysms that punctuated early human history. A society capable of constructing monumental structures, tracking precessional cycles, and performing complex rituals would not simply vanish without leaving traces. But if such a society were devastated by rising seas, by drought, by sudden climatic reversals, its survivors might preserve knowledge in mythic form rather than practical form. Over generations, metaphors replace manuals, symbols replace systems, priests replace scientists. Thus, the gods of myth may not have been supernatural beings, but the distant memories of knowledge keepers, individuals whose understanding of the world was so vast that later generations could only describe them in divine terms. The last Anunnaki king, then, may represent the final individual capable of holding the full coherence of that older worldview. When he disappeared, the system collapsed from unity into diversity. This collapse is visible in linguistic patterns as well. Many of the world's oldest languages share proto-words for star, water, measure, and sky that seem to derive from a root older than any known civilization. Linguists call this a proto-human lexicon, though cannot explain how such stability persisted. Some words resist change for millennia, reflecting concepts so deeply embedded in human cognition that they trace back to an era before linguistic divergence. The same is true of symbols. The spiral, the cross, the serpent, the eye, the tree, they appear everywhere, often in contexts preceding agriculture. Some argue these symbols reflect universal human neurobiology, yet they also map neatly onto stories of cosmic cycles, floods, and knowledge bearers. If humanity inherited these symbols, they may reflect a memory older than any place associated with them. The king becomes a symbol of this inheritance. His story is not one of power, but of transmission. The question, then, is how far that transmission reached and what pieces survived most clearly. Some of the most intriguing fragments appear in early astronomical records. The Sumerians tracked the cycles of Venus, with precision rivaling much later civilizations. The Babylonians inherited star lists that appear far older than their own scribal tradition. Aboriginal Australians preserved star narratives tied to events 10,000 years old. The Dogon of Mali held knowledge of Sirius beyond what naked eye observation permits. Polynesian navigators used a cosmic map that encoded stellar positions across thousands of nautical miles. These echoes of deep sky knowledge suggest that the cosmic worldview of the forgotten age did not vanish entirely. Instead, it persisted in pockets, embedded in traditions where isolation protected them from the erosion that affected more urban societies. If the last Anunnaki king existed as a symbolic epicenter for such knowledge, his influence may be most visible not in texts but in anomalies, those moments in the archaeological record that should not exist, yet do. The Piri race map, drawn in the 16th century, but based on sources far older, depicts parts of Antarctica's coastline once free of ice. The Ubaid figurines of southern Iraq, with their elongated forms and reptilian features, seem to reference beings remembered as otherworldly. The precise geodetic knowledge underlying the Great Pyramid, still not fully understood, suggests a grasp of Earth's dimensions inconsistent with the tools traditionally available. None of these anomalies prove anything alone, but collectively they form a constellation, a faint outline of a story whose centre has been lost. That centre may be the last Anunnaki king. But the king's narrative does not end with disappearance, for even in withdrawal, the memory of his lineage continued to shape civilizations. The Sumerians built their cities with awareness of cosmic order. The Egyptians aligned their kingdom to the rhythm of the Nile and the path of the stars. The Indus Valley constructed cities with standardized measures. The Maya created calendars spanning thousands of years. These were not coincidences. They were attempts, successful and unsuccessful, to reconstruct a worldview they felt slipping away. The myths describing the return of the gods may reflect a longing to restore that lost coherence, a faint hope that the world would one day remember what it once knew. But longing is not memory, and memory is not knowledge. What survived are shadows. What survived are symbols. What survived are the faint echoes of an age when humanity perceived the cosmos with a clarity that feels almost impossible to imagine today. The last Anunnaki king becomes the boundary marker between that clarity and our fragmented inheritance. His departure is the moment when humanity stepped into a world governed by history, chronology, and linear time, abandoning the cyclical consciousness that defined the age before. Yet even now, the boundary is not fully closed. There are moments, brief quiet, unbidden, when the mind stirs with something older than itself. Experiences of déjà vu upon seeing ancient sites, a sense of recognition before structures, whose builders left no explanation. The feeling that beneath the surface of modern life runs a deeper rhythm, one connected to the pulse of the earth, the sky, and the cycles that span epochs rather than years. Perhaps that rhythm is the lingering resonance of the world the last Anunnaki king once guarded. Perhaps it is the echo of a question we have never fully stopped asking. And as the thread of this inquiry drifts deeper into the dim past, another quiet uncertainty gathers at the horizon, unsettling, unresolved, and waiting like a shadow beneath the known. If the memory of that ancient world still stirs within us, what else lies dormant, waiting for us to remember? There are chapters of human history that feel less like narratives and more like dreams half remembered, moments lingering at the edge of consciousness, slipping away whenever one tries to grasp them directly. The story of the last Anunnaki king belongs to this twilight zone between remembering and forgetting, a place where truth behaves like mist, present yet impossible to hold. And the deeper one follows the faint trail left by the earlier civilizations, the more it becomes clear that the mystery is not simply about a lost figure or a vanished lineage. It is about the strange continuity of patterns that should not have survived the storms of time, yet somehow did, embedded in landscapes, rituals, and the quiet architecture of human intuition. By the time the first true cities of Mesopotamia rose from the river plains, Uruk, Kish, Lagash, Eridu, the memory of an earlier world was already fading. The stories preserved in tablets were echoes of echoes, fragments retold in temple schools by scribes who understood they were inheriting something ancient, but no longer knew its shape. And yet, beneath their attempts at preserving order, a subtle tension pulsed, the sense that their world was only a shadow of a more unified past, a past they tried to rebuild, but which continually eluded their grasp. This tension becomes particularly visible when examining the way early civilizations conceptualized kingship. To the Sumerians, kingship was not merely political authority, it was cosmic alignment, a state of harmony between heaven and earth that allowed the world to remain balanced. This idea appears in the earliest surviving myths and persists throughout Mesopotamian history, but its roots lie deeper than any existing text, pointing to a conceptual structure inherited from a time when rulership was intertwined with astronomical cycles. Every early king was not only a leader but a mediator between realms. He had to align himself with the sky, the seasons, and the unseen forces believed to govern fate. His palace was not simply a residence, it was a cosmological diagram. His rituals did not serve ceremonies alone. They echoed ancient rhythms connecting the human world to something older and grander. The last Anunnaki king, as remembered in myth, may have represented the final embodiment of this older form of kingship, a sovereign whose authority was not self-generated, but inherited from an age when cosmic cycles and human governance were not separate realms. His departure marks the beginning of human kingship as we know it, striving, imperfect, severed from the deep knowledge that once anchored it. The evidence of this severance is subtle, but widespread. Across the ancient world, kingship myths follow similar trajectories. The first rulers are divine or semi-divine, their reigns impossibly long, their connection to cosmic order direct and unquestioned. Later rulers become human, their reigns shorter, their authority contested. Over time, rituals multiply in complexity as societies try to compensate for their diminishing access to the original source of legitimacy. This evolution suggests not invention, but loss. It implies that earlier forms of rulership remembered in myth were not fantasy, but cultural memories of a system once functional, now decayed. If the last Anunnaki king symbolizes the end of that system, then his story is the hinge upon which humanity transitioned from an age of cosmic kingship to an age of human kingship, an irreversible shift from alignment to approximation. This shift becomes clear when examining the earliest temple complexes. In cities like Eridu, the temple was the heart of the settlement, its center aligned with cardinal directions and its structure embodying cosmic order. But over time, temples grew more elaborate, more monumental, more focused on maintaining ritual than preserving meaning. The earliest temples were simple, functional, oriented with intention. Later ones displayed grandeur, hierarchy, and a kind of architectural anxiety, as though societies were trying to rebuild something whose essence they had already forgotten. This architectural anxiety appears elsewhere as well. In Egypt, early dynastic temples show a quiet elegance rooted in cosmic geometry, while later temples pile on layers of symbolism, as priests attempt to preserve rituals no longer fully understood. In the Indus Valley, early cities exhibit startling coherence. Grids, drainage systems, standardized weights, suggesting a memory of an older organizational principle. But in their final centuries, chaos emerges, orthodoxy weakens. The coherence dissolves. Something similar occurs in the Americas. The earliest monumental centers, Caral, Göbekli like Chavin, the first Olmec sites, display a unity between structure, sound, and natural landscape that later civilizations struggle to replicate without dilution. Over generations, the cosmological system fractures into regional variants. Rituals persist, but their coherence wanes. This pattern repeats too consistently to be ignored. Early clarity, late confusion. Early unity, late fragmentation. Early cosmic alignment, late political ambition. It is almost as though the earliest generations after a catastrophe were working from memory. Memory so ancient that its origin was beyond their understanding. A memory tied not to isolated cultures, but to a shared ancestral lineage. And within this lineage, the figure of a final custodian looms, the last Anunnaki king, the final master of a worldview that later generations could only imitate. The question then becomes how this ancient worldview survived at all. The answer may lie in sacred geography. Many of the world's earliest sacred sites are built on places with geological anomalies, fault lines, magnetic anomalies, underground caverns, resonant chambers, or natural infrasound frequencies. This is not coincidence. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, Edfu, Chavin, Tiwanaku, and the megalithic complexes of Europe often amplify natural vibrations and create altered states of consciousness. These states were once integral to rituals connecting individuals with cosmic cycles. If the earliest civilizations inherited knowledge of these places, then the last Anunnaki king may have been remembered not only for his wisdom, but for his ability to navigate the sacred landscape of the world, a landscape whose energetic properties later cultures sensed but could no longer decode. This decoding may have been the true heart of the ancient knowledge lineage. Not technology in the modern sense, but a profound awareness of how consciousness interacts with environment, rhythm, and time. A worldview in which the boundary between the physical and the metaphysical was not a barrier, but a permeable membrane. When that worldview collapsed, humanity lost more than techniques. It lost a way of perceiving. Myth becomes the natural result of such a loss. When a civilization can no longer comprehend the worldview of its ancestors, it transforms that worldview into stories built from the fragments that remain. The last Anunnaki king becomes a mythic figure, not because he never existed, but because later cultures could no longer understand the nature of his existence. They remembered him through metaphors, symbols, and myths that preserved the essence but not the detail. His divinity may reflect the way he embodied a knowledge that transcended the cognitive limits of the cultures that followed. His withdrawal may reflect the severing of humanity from the cosmic order rather than a literal departure. This severing appears vividly in the transformation of timekeeping. Early humans tracked precessional cycles spanning 26,000 years. They encoded these rhythms in monuments and myths. Later civilizations struggled to maintain even agricultural calendars. Over time, the connection between ritual and actual cosmic movement weakened. People remembered festivals but forgot why they were performed. Priests repeated formulas whose original reference were lost. Calendars fractured into regional variations. Time itself became fragmented. This fragmentation mirrors the dissolution of the king's lineage. A civilization that had once grasped epochs lost the ability to perceive beyond seasons. The last Anunnaki king, if he embodied mastery of cosmic time, would have represented the final human link to a scale of understanding later generations could barely imagine. The loss of such a link would reverberate across millennia, shaping religions, philosophies, and cultural identities. It would create a sense of longing, an ache for something unnamed, a yearning for a golden age remembered dimly, imperfectly, through stories of gods who once walked among men. It would also create an intellectual vacuum into which new interpretations rushed. Priesthoods emerged to replace the earlier lineage of knowledge keepers. Myths grew increasingly elaborate to fill the silence left by lost understanding. Rituals became substitutes for direct experience. One sees this vacuum clearly in the way later civilizations projected their desires and fears onto the ancient past. The Egyptians looked back to Zep-Tepi as a perfect age. The Greeks imagined the age of Kronos. The Vedic tradition mourned the loss of higher ages. The Maya encoded long cycles in hopes of reconnecting with their origins. All of these reflect the same psychological rupture, the loss of direct connection to the old world. In this rupture, the last Anunnaki king becomes a symbol of everything that slipped away. Cosmic alignment, ancestral knowledge, harmony between heaven and earth, unity between consciousness and landscape. And yet, the most haunting aspect of his story is not his disappearance, but the persistence of his shadow. For even after his lineage dissolved, traces of his world continued to shape human thought in ways subtle and enduring. They appear in the geometry of temples, in the rhythms of chants, in the orientation of sacred sites, in recurring symbols, in mythic archetypes, in the persistent human intuition that the world once held a coherence, now lost. Perhaps this is why the figure of the last Anunnaki king refuses to fade completely. He embodies a memory humanity has never fully forgotten, a memory felt more often than understood, a memory that surfaces in quiet moments when standing before ancient ruins or beneath a sky unpolluted by light, the stars moving slowly across the darkness as they once did for those who understood their secrets. And in that stillness, another question rises from the deep well of the past. Not spoken, not certain, but gently insistent, like a thought stirring at the edge of sleep. If the world once held a greater coherence, what remains of it now, waiting beneath the surface of our forgetting? There are moments when tracing the hidden curves of ancient history in which the distance between the past and the present seems to collapse, folding like soft cloth until two epochs touch. In these moments, one can almost sense the breath of an age that no longer exists. An age remembered not through artifacts or inscriptions alone, but through something far subtler, a persistent feeling, as though the world once operated along a rhythm more harmonious, more attuned to the deepest structures of reality. As the trail of the last Anunnaki king winds into its next layer, this feeling intensifies, quiet, insistent, threaded through the spaces where written memory fails. By the time human civilization entered the 3rd millennium BCE, the shift from cosmic kingship to human kingship was nearly complete. The figure remembered as the last Anunnaki king belonged to an age already fading into myth. But the strange thing about myth is that it does not simply preserve stories, it preserves frameworks. Beneath the poetic imagery and cosmological language, there remain traces of an older system of understanding, one that modelled reality through principles now only dimly recognized. And it is in these underlying principles that the presence of the last Anunnaki king continues to flicker, not as a ruler engraved in tablets, but as the final representative of a worldview that shaped the earliest civilizations from behind the veil of time. The pursuit of this worldview leads inevitably into the domain of sacred proportion, geometry, number, and alignment woven into the earliest structures built by human hands. At first glance, these elements seem incidental, perhaps even accidental, but the deeper one studies them, the clearer their intention becomes. The builders of Göbekli Tepe, thousands of years before the Sumerians, arranged their enclosures in patterns that reflect geometric knowledge, more advanced than expected for their time. Many of the T-pillars align with significant celestial events, not only solstices, but particular star risings associated with precessional movement. This suggests an understanding of cycles far longer than any individual human lifespan. In early Egypt, the geometry of sacred structures displays ratios later formalized in Pythagorean mathematics. Temples follow a pattern of progression, mirroring celestial movement. The orientation of the pyramids, aligned almost perfectly to cardinal directions, reflects astronomical precision within a margin of error, astonishing for their era. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats follow layered geometric sequences, each tier reflecting cosmic hierarchy. Their base measurements often correspond to numerical systems rooted in the sexagesimal tradition, a system whose elegance and complexity modern mathematicians still admire. Even in the Indus Valley, the grid-like city planning of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa follows proportional rules hinting at an inherited mathematical template. These similarities do not imply direct cultural contact across all these regions. Instead, they point toward a shared inheritance of geometric intuition, a memory carried across continents, surviving catastrophe and migration. If the last Anunnaki king presided over a civilization steeped in such knowledge, then his legacy would not be written solely in mythic genealogies. It would exist in the unconscious mathematical impulses that guided humanity's earliest architectural achievements. His world may have encoded meaning into structure so thoroughly that even when the cultural memory vanished, the impulse remained. This idea becomes even more compelling when considering the earliest star maps. The Sumerians' Mul-Apin texts record constellations and star paths with a precision that implies much older observation. Several researchers note that the layout of constellations referenced in these tablets does not match the sky of the 3rd millennium BCE, but a sky thousands of years older, possibly dating to the end of the last ice age. If these observations originated from a pre-cataclysmic society, then the last Anunnaki king may have been part of a lineage that tracked celestial cycles across epochs, encoding their knowledge into structures that would outlive them. When their world collapsed, their understanding of cosmic rhythm fragmented, but not entirely. Fragments remained embedded in architecture, ritual, and number. Yet this raises a deeper question. Why did so many ancient civilizations feel compelled to align their structures with the cosmos? Why did the earliest constructions reflect such precision, only for later societies to drift into symbolic approximation? The answer may lie in the psychological residue of the forgotten age. If the last Anunnaki king represented a worldview in which cosmic order and human life were inseparable, then early humans inheriting that memory would instinctively build in a way that mirrored the sky. They would orient temples and enclosures not to please gods, but to recreate, however dimly, a pattern once lived. Over centuries, the reasons behind these alignments faded, but the impulse persisted, echoing through generations like a muscle memory of the collective mind. This muscle memory surfaces not only in architecture, but in ritual. Across the ancient world, rituals reenact cosmic cycles through dance, chant, and symbolic action. The Sumerians performed ceremonies tied to planetary motion. The Egyptians enacted the rebirth of the sun. The Vedic traditions mirrored the rhythm of seasons and cosmic creation. The Maya aligned their rituals with precise intervals of their long count calendar. These rituals seem to stem from a shared intuition that human existence once moved in harmony with the cosmos, and that reenacting these patterns preserved balance. If the last Anunnaki king was remembered as the final bridge between humanity and the cosmic worldview, then rituals may be the faint echo of the guidance he once offered. They are attempts to restore a lost connection, a connection that once defined kingship itself. This becomes particularly clear when examining how ancient societies conceptualize memory. For the Sumerians, writing was not merely communication. It was a form of preservation, a way to safeguard truth against the erosion of time. Many early texts speak of knowledge kept on tablets from before the flood, suggesting a tradition of recording that predates known history. Whether or not these tablets existed, the idea reflects a cultural memory of something older than the civilizations themselves. Yet the earliest forms of writing appear suddenly, fully formed, as though adapted from an earlier symbolic system, rather than invented from scratch. The same is true of early calendars, early legal codes, and early cosmologies. They appear polished, complete, coherent, before later generations begin to complicate them. This pattern, early clarity, later complexity, is the inverse of what one would expect if these systems evolved naturally. Instead, it suggests inheritance, followed by reinterpretation, followed by fragmentation. And beneath that fragmentation lies the ghost of a forgotten unity. If the last Anunnaki king presided over the final generation of a civilization rooted in unity of architecture, ritual, astronomy, mathematics, kingship, and cosmology, then the world that followed inherited only fragments. His departure symbolizes the rupture between unity and fragmentation, coherence and confusion. This rupture is not merely cultural, it is psychological. The earliest myths often present the world before the flood as harmonious, ordered, guided. After the flood, the world becomes unpredictable, violent, filled with chaos. These descriptions may reflect more than environmental memory. They may represent a collective awareness that humanity once lived under a system that collapsed. In the shadows of that collapse lies another clue, hidden in the strange convergence of myths about beings who withdrew, ascended, or returned to the sky. These beings arrive during times of chaos, impart knowledge, guide cities or tribes, then depart, leaving humans to continue alone. Nearly every ancient civilization carries such a myth. In Sumer, the Anunnaki retreat after the flood. In Egypt, the gods withdraw after Zeptepi. In Greece, the age of Kronos ends abruptly. In India, the knowledge of the rishis becomes inaccessible. In the Andes, Viracocha departs across the sea. Among the First Nations of North America, sky people leave the earth. In the Pacific, ancestral navigators return to the stars. This pattern does not point to literal divine beings. It points to a collective memory of a lineage, teachers, sages, astronomers, architects, who vanish from history after the cataclysm. The last Anunnaki king may have been remembered as the final figure of this lineage, because after him, the chain broke. The question then is what happened to the knowledge itself. Some of it transformed into myth, some into ritual, some into building techniques, some into calendars, some into symbolic languages, and some into fears of chaos, floods, collapse, and the unpredictable cycles of nature. But a portion of the knowledge did not disappear. It simply withdrew into domains that modern people rarely consider part of ancient science: consciousness, sound, vibration, and geomagnetic sensitivity. Across the ancient world, temples and sacred sites exhibit acoustic properties that alter perception. Experiments conducted in underground chambers reveal that certain frequencies induce trance states similar to those reported in shamanic traditions. This suggests that ancient builders intentionally designed these structures not only for ceremony, but for consciousness modulation. If the last Anunnaki king belonged to a tradition that understood the relationship between sound, architecture, and cognition, then his departure would signify the final loss of a form of knowledge that connected the human mind to the rhythms of the natural world. And here the most haunting possibility emerges, that the forgotten world was not primarily defined by material sophistication, but by cognitive sophistication. Perhaps the ancients possessed a sensitivity now dulled, an ability to perceive natural cycles intuitively, to synchronize consciousness with environment, to experience unity where modern humans perceive separation. If so, the last Anunnaki king would represent the final moments when this mode of awareness was preserved in its fullness. His departure marks the transition from a world of experiential perception to a world of conceptual interpretation, a shift that fundamentally changed the trajectory of civilization. This shift appears in the earliest philosophical texts of Greece, India, and China. Each speaks of an earlier age when humans lived in harmony with cosmic rhythm. Each laments the loss of direct connection to the essence of the world. Each describes a longing for return, a return not to a place, but to a state of being. This longing surfaces today in ways that feel almost instinctive. People still seek meaning in the stars, resonance in sacred spaces, unity with the natural world. These yearnings may be the faint memory of the worldview the last Anunnaki king embodied, echoes of a forgotten coherence. As the thread of this inquiry draws deeper into the labyrinth of ancient memory, the shape of the forgotten world becomes faintly visible. not as a civilization with advanced machines or supernatural beings, but as a culture built upon harmony, perception, and cosmic unity. A culture whose final guardian became myth because no later generation could fully comprehend what he represented. And in the quiet edges of this realization, another question slips through the veil. Gentle, persistent, and laden with the weight of forgotten centuries. If the last Anunnaki king marked the end of one form of knowing, what form awaits those who one day remember? There are points along the winding trail of forgotten history when the silence itself begins to feel weighted, as though it has been carefully arranged, layer by layer, over something humanity was never meant to lose entirely. A silence that is not absence, but concealment. It stretches beneath the ruins of ancient cities, beneath the inscriptions worn thin by wind and sand, beneath the myths repeated so often, their meanings blurred, yet never quite vanished. And when following the faint outline of the last Anunnaki king into this deeper silence, one begins to sense the shape of something profound. Not a story of gods ruling over mortals, but a story of memory slipping from the grasp of an entire species. By the time Mesopotamia reached its cultural peak, the ziggurats rising, the cuneiform tablets multiplying, the laws codified and cities bustling, the world that gave birth to the myth of the last Anunnaki king was already thousands of years gone. And yet its shadow endured so vividly that even the most pragmatic scribes wrote of kings before the flood, rulers whose names stretched back beyond time itself. To them, the distant past was not a void. It was an age suffused with meaning, an age they believed their own civilization could never truly replicate. What lingers most hauntingly in this memory is not the grandeur attributed to the primordial world, but the distinct sense of order that once governed it. Early myths describe eras in which knowledge flowed effortlessly, in which the structure of time matched the architecture of the heavens, and in which the act of building, farming, ruling, and observing the cosmos were not separate disciplines, but facets of a single integrated worldview. This unity did not survive the cataclysms that reshaped the planet at the end of the Pleistocene, but its imprint survived, fragmented, obscure, scattered around the world like pieces of a broken vessel. To understand this fragmentation, one must follow the clues that remain, clues that appear not only in texts and ruins, but in the quiet parallels between civilizations, long separated by ocean, mountain, and desert. Take, for instance, the ancient obsession with cardinal directions. From the Americas to Asia, from Africa to Europe, early sacred sites align with precision that defies the expected progression of human development. The builders of the first enclosures at Göbekli Tepe understood orientation. So did the pyramid builders in Egypt. So did the city planners in the Indus Valley. So did the pre-Incan architects in the Andes. So did the mound builders of North America. It is not that humans everywhere simply like straight lines. It is that humanity appears to have inherited a template, a way of situating oneself in the world that reflects a deeper cosmological order. A template preserved long after the source of its logic was forgotten. This inheritance becomes even clearer when considering the earliest myths of creation. In Sumer, the world is structured around the Abzu and the heavens. In Egypt, it emerges from the waters of Nun. In Greece, from the primordial deep. In Polynesia, from the dark ocean. In Mesoamerica, from the sacred waters before time began. Water, darkness, depth, symbols that may encode the trauma of rising seas and lost lands. Symbols that echo the submergence of an entire world capable of preserving knowledge across generations. The last Anunnaki king may represent the memory of the final sovereign of that world, the one who presided before the waters claimed the plains and coastlines now hidden beneath sediment and salt. But his story does not end with disappearance. It continues through the ways ancient cultures attempted to recreate the lost order. Not perfectly, but sincerely, instinctively, compulsively. It appears in their rituals, their laws, their calendars, their monuments, their stories of divine descent. Consider the structure of ancient law codes, the code of Ur-Nammu, the laws of Hammurabi, the Hittite codes. All share a logic that suggests inheritance rather than invention. They emphasize balance, reciprocity, cosmic justice. The image of a king receiving authority from a higher realm is not depicted as metaphor, but as a reenactment of an older memory of rulers guided by principles beyond human whim. This concept echoes in Egypt as well, where the pharaohs claimed to uphold Ma'at, the cosmic order. Ma'at was not merely morality, it was alignment with the fundamental structure of the universe. To act against Ma'at was to unravel reality itself. This worldview resembles the Sumerian belief that kingship descended from a divine realm, not as privilege, but as responsibility. These parallels across cultures hint at a common root, older than any tablet or hieroglyph. If the last Anunnaki king embodied alignment with cosmic order, then early civilizations inherited not his biological lineage, but the memory of his role. And as memory eroded, mythology filled the gaps. This erosion becomes particularly visible in the transformation of cosmology. Early humans mapped the sky with extraordinary precision, tracking cycles far beyond the needs of subsistence. Why did they care about the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle spanning nearly 26,000 years? Why did they carve solstice alignments into stone temples? Why did they mark the risings of stars that carried no agricultural significance? It suggests that skywatching was not a pragmatic activity, but a ritual act rooted in a memory of cosmic unity, a way of replicating an order once embodied by leaders remembered as divine. If the last Anunnaki king presided over a worldview in which rulers synchronized humanity with the heavens, then the obsession with celestial cycles across ancient cultures may be the faint echo of that synchronization. But even as this cosmic framework persisted, another pattern emerged, a growing fear of misalignment. Myths around the world describe ages of chaos, disorder, and decline. These myths often place the last era of harmony in the distant past, an era linked to ancestral rulers whose wisdom could no longer be replicated. From the Sumerian flood myth to the Greek decline from the Age of Gold to Iron, from the Hindu transition from Satya Yuga to Kali Yuga, from the Mesoamerican stories of previous worlds destroyed and remade, these narratives converge on a single theme. Something was lost, something essential. That something may be the worldview of the forgotten era, the age overseen by the last Anunnaki king. To explore what was lost, one must shift focus from monuments and myths to humanity itself. Early humans appear to have possessed heightened sensitivity to their environment, a responsiveness that modern people rarely exhibit. This sensitivity may have been a product of necessity, but many ancient traditions describe it as a cultivated state, a form of awareness that connected individuals to the rhythms of earth and sky. This is not mystical speculation. It is supported by archaeological and anthropological evidence. Indigenous traditions around the world preserve practices that synchronize human perception with natural cycles, practices that may be remnants of the older worldview. Consider the Aboriginal Australian dreaming, which encodes star maps, ecological knowledge, and ritual cosmology into oral tradition. Some of these stories reference geological events from 10,000 years ago. This longevity suggests a capacity for cultural memory that predates written language. Consider the Polynesian navigators who read waves, stars, winds, and bird movements with near superhuman precision, a skill set that reflects an integrated worldview rarely found in modern societies. Consider the shamanic traditions of Siberia, the Amazon, and Africa, which emphasize connection to the unseen structures of reality through altered states and rhythmic practices. Their rituals often incorporate sound frequencies that ancient structures around the world seem engineered to amplify. These practices may be the last living threads of a worldview once universal, before fragmentation scattered humanity across divergent cultural paths. If the last Anunnaki king embodied this unified worldview, then the loss of his lineage may have been less about political upheaval than cognitive fragmentation. Humanity transitioned from a culture of coherence to a culture of specialization. The priests took astronomy, the rulers took law, the artisans took geometry, the shamans took sound, the storytellers took myth, the philosophers took metaphysics, the farmers took seasons. What had once been one became many, and the many no longer recognized their shared origin. This fragmentation explains why myths of the last era appear contradictory. Each culture inherited a piece of the whole, interpreting it through its own lens. The Sumerians preserved the genealogical memory. The Egyptians preserved the cosmological memory. The Vedic traditions preserved the metaphysical memory. The Maya preserved the calendrical memory. Indigenous peoples preserved the intuitive memory. Together, these pieces sketch a dim outline of a forgotten system, a system whose last guardian became myth because no single culture preserved enough to recreate the full picture. And yet, even in fragmentation, something persisted. A subtle thread connecting all these traditions, a quiet insistence that the world once held a deeper order. This insistence is not based on fantasy. It arises from the persistence of patterns that should not exist if civilizations developed independently. It arises from myths that describe geological events with accuracy, long before geological science existed. It arises from structures aligned to celestial cycles, difficult to track without sophisticated knowledge. It arises from rituals that encode mathematical principles without written explanation. These patterns suggest that the last Anunnaki king is not a figure to be proven or disproven, but a symbol of the last coherent expression of a worldview humanity has been trying to remember ever since. And as the journey into this forgotten world deepens, a final layer begins to shimmer. The possibility that the greatest loss was not material or architectural, but internal. Perhaps the last Anunnaki king represents not a person, but a state of human consciousness. One attuned to rhythms now inaccessible to most. One capable of perceiving unity where modern minds perceive separation. One rooted in an unbroken relationship with the cosmos. When that state vanished, the age of myth began. When memory dimmed, history began. When unity fractured, civilization began. And in the quiet spaces of that fracture, a question has lingered like a soft shadow across the millennia. A question that grows more insistent the deeper one listens to the faint pulse of the forgotten age. If humanity once lived in harmony with a greater order, is it possible that some distant part of us still remembers the way back? There are endings that do not feel like endings at all. Only thresholds where the light changes, where the air grows still, where something ancient brushes against the edge of awareness before slipping away again. The story of the last Anunnaki king arrives at such a threshold now, not with a conclusion, nor with the certainty of revelation, but with the same quiet strangeness that has followed it from the beginning. A story built not from answers, but from echoes. Echoes carried across epochs, reshaped by catastrophe, preserved in myth, scattered across continents, and whispered through the long corridors of human memory. By the time the civilizations of the ancient world reached their maturity, the Old Kingdom rising on the Nile, the Indus cities humming with meticulous order, the early dynasties forming in China, the world had already forgotten more than it knew. What survived did so, not because it was recorded, but because it was repeated. Repeated until the repetition itself became a ritual, and the ritual became a belief, and the belief became a story told beneath dim lamplight to children who never understood that the tale they were hearing was older than their bloodline, older than their city, older than the very language the words carried. This is the strange thing about memory on a civilizational scale. What is lost is often the structure, not the impulse. People forget the reason behind a ritual, but they continue performing it. They forget the origin of a symbol, but they continue carving it. They forget the purpose of a monument, but they continue building them. Beneath all of this lies a kind of ghost logic, an instinctive rhythm inherited from ancestors who once lived according to a worldview that fractured so completely that only its shadows remain. The last Anunnaki king is the largest of these shadows, a figure standing at the edge of recorded time, cast in silhouettes that shift with every retelling. To the Sumerians, he was the final ruler of an age when beings of extraordinary wisdom guided humanity. To later scribes, he was myth, to modern scholars, a symbol. Yet symbols are rarely born from nothing. They cling to the faint outline of something once real, something that impressed itself so deeply upon the human psyche that neither flood, nor empire, nor millennium could erase it. As the trail grows fainter, one begins to realize that the king's story may never have been about a person at all, but about what the world felt like before the rupture. Before the ice melted, before the seas rose, before memory scattered, and knowledge splintered into irreconcilable fragments. His Rain may represent the last era during which humanity lived in alignment with the deeper structures of existence, before the cataclysm, forced adaptation, forgetting, reinvention. When that world collapsed, its memory did not vanish. It descended into the collective unconscious, where it survived as mythic archetype. This sinking of memory into myth can be observed in the earliest spiritual systems. The concept of cyclical ages, the Hindu yugas, the Greek ages of man, the Sumerian pre- and post-Diluvian eras, suggests an awareness that history is not linear. Something resets, something shifts, something ends and begins again. But the new beginning always feels dimmer than what came before, as though the light of the previous age was too bright to fully extinguish. In every civilization's mythology, there is a moment when the gods retreat, when the guardians step back, when the teachers depart. Often this departure occurs after a great upheaval. A flood, a fire, a cosmic battle, a shift in the heavens. These stories mirror geological and climatic changes at the end of the Pleistocene. They also mirror psychological changes, a realization that the world had entered a new era in which humans were left to navigate without guidance. If the last Anunnaki king symbolizes the final remnant of this guidance, his departure becomes a metaphor for the end of childhood. The moment humanity became responsible for its own path, no longer sheltered beneath a cosmological order it could instinctively perceive. After this departure, something in the human story changes dramatically. Civilization accelerates, but coherence fades. The earliest cities of Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley display near-perfect organizational harmony, followed by periods of confusion, decentralization, and collapse. Architecture becomes more elaborate, but less cosmically aligned. Rituals grow more ornate, but less understood. Kingship becomes more powerful, but less sacred. In a sense, the world becomes louder, more complex, more ambitious, but somehow emptier. A subtle disconnection enters the collective, a sense of longing reflected in myths of lost golden ages. This longing's not nostalgia, it is memory, a memory that never dies completely. To explore it further, one must look not at what was built, but at what was feared. The Sumerians feared the return of chaotic waters. The Egyptians feared the collapse of Mayat. The Vedic tradition feared descent into ignorance. The Maya feared the end of cycles before renewal. These fears reflect trauma not only from environmental events, but from the deeper trauma of losing a worldview once held collectively. The last Anunnaki king stands at the centre of this trauma, not as a tyrant, not as a supernatural being, but as the final anchor of a coherent worldview. When his lineage vanished, whether through catastrophe, migration, dissolution, or simple passage of time, the world lost the last stabilizing thread connecting it to an older, unified understanding of existence. The idea that knowledge once flowed freely, that rulers once aligned themselves with cosmic principles, that sound, nature, sky, and consciousness were once part of a single system. This idea haunts the earliest civilizations. They built their cities in the image of that lost unity. They inscribed their laws to preserve its memory. They reenacted its myths to keep the echo alive. But an echo, no matter how clear, is not a voice. And so, humanity entered a long era of approximation, attempts to recreate the original order from fragments, attempts that grew increasingly elaborate as the memory faded. This elaboration is visible in the evolution of myth itself. The earliest myths are surprisingly simple. Water, sky, earth, order, chaos, cycles, renewal. Over time, these myths accumulate layers of narrative, gods, conflicts, genealogies, a sign not of increasing knowledge, but of increasing distance from the original source. The same pattern appears in architecture. The simplest megalithic structures align with cosmic events with subtle precision. Later structures grow more monumental, more decorated, more symbolic, yet less aligned. The builders of early wonders seem to understand something later cultures try to imitate without fully comprehending. This shift, from understanding to imitation, is one of the clearest signs that a profound transition occurred, a transition that may be encoded in the myth of the last Anunnaki king. His story may be the last remnant of the age before imitation, the last time humanity experienced a direct relationship with whatever force shaped the earliest memories of cosmic unity. But the question remains, what exactly ended when he departed? Perhaps the end was not the collapse of a civilization, but the collapse of a mode of perception, a way of seeing the world that no longer exists in the modern mind, except as instinct, symbol, or longing. Perhaps the ancient worldview was not based on supernatural beings, but on a form of consciousness that allowed early humans to perceive patterns we no longer see, geomagnetic fields, harmonic resonances, subtle energies, the deep logic of natural cycles. If this was the case, then the last Anunnaki king was not a king in the political sense, but the last exemplar of that perceptual world. And when that perceptual world dissolved, his memory transformed from knowledge into myth. This perspective allows the story to hold truth without requiring literalism. It suggests that humanity's earliest traditions recall a real transformation, one in which an entire cognitive paradigm shifted, leaving behind only fragments. Fragments we continue to uncover. Fragments we continue to misinterpret. Fragments that continue to affect us in ways we do not fully comprehend. For even now in the modern world, the ancient impulses persist. People stand beneath ancient ruins and feel a strange familiarity. They stare at the night sky and experience a quiet stir of recognition. They seek meaning in cycles, symbols, and rituals without knowing why. They sense a missing piece, something the world once held, something that once guided us. This sense may be the legacy of the forgotten age, the final resonance of the worldview embodied by the last Anunnaki king. And as the thread of this long, drifting story approaches its quiet close, one realizes that the true mystery is not what happened to him, but what remains of him within us. His story does not end in vanished cities or drowned coastlines. It ends in the quiet spaces of the human mind, the part that leans toward wonder, that listens for echoes, that reaches for patterns older than speech. Perhaps this is why the myth endures, not to reveal a secret, but to remind us that the world we inhabit is only one version of the world we are capable of knowing. And so the story settles into its final stillness, not with finality, but with the soft inevitability of a long breath left unresolved. The silence stretches, the shadows lengthen, and in the fading light of this journey, a final thought drifts into view, unbidden, unanswered, and lingering like a soft imprint on the edge of consciousness. If humanity once lived closer to the hidden structure of the world, what waits for us in the spaces where remembering begins again?